The sun had barely lifted above the hills when Henry Doss stepped out of his farmhouse. The morning air was damp, heavy with the smell of soil after a night of light rain. He moved slowly, the weight of age showing in his shoulders but not in his pace. It was another ordinary morning on his quiet stretch of farmland in Bradley County, Tennessee. Henry followed the same pattern every day. Feed the chickens, check the barn, warm his coffee on the porch before tending to the field. Routine was the rhythm of his life, and he rarely broke it. That morning, he filled a dented metal bucket with feed and walked toward the chicken coop. The hens clucked softly, gathering at his boots as the first streaks of light touched the barn roof. Inside the barn, Henry checked his tools, adjusted a loose latch, and pushed the heavy door open to let in air. The radio in his kitchen played faintly through the open window, a country song blending into the low hum of morning insects. Everything was still, ordinary, peaceful, but sometime between those quiet moments and the rise of full daylight, something changed. By 8 o'clock, the coffee cup Henry had left on the porch was still full and steaming. His chair sat empty. The truck beside the gravel path looked untouched, though its engine felt faintly warm, as if it had been started and stopped again. Across the field, neighbor Earl Cates noticed the odd silence. He had seen Henry moving near the barn earlier, a figure bent slightly under his hat. But now there was nothing. No movement. No sound. The chickens wandered loose by the fence. Earl called out once, then twice. Only the wind answered. An hour passed. Earl crossed the field, uneasy. The farmhouse door stood open. The radio still played. Breakfast waited untouched on the table. Nothing was missing. Nothing was broken. Yet something was terribly wrong. Earl drove to town and told the sheriff's office that Henry Doss was missing. By midday, 2 deputies arrived. They searched the house, the barn, the field, even the old storage shed behind the chicken coop. They found no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no footprints leaving the property. Sheriff Raymond Holt joined them before sunset. He had known Henry for years, a quiet, steady man who never traveled far from home. Holt ordered a perimeter search. Volunteers arrived with flashlights and dogs, combing the property as the evening shadows stretched long across the fields. Near the back of the land, deputies followed faint boot prints in the mud, matching Henry's size. The trail led toward the creek, where reeds grew thick along the bank. The footprints stopped suddenly near a slick patch of earth. Beyond that, nothing. As the night deepened, the air grew colder. Crickets sang over the low rumble of search vehicles. The farmhouse stood dimly lit, its porch light flickering in the wind. Holt moved slowly toward the main gate, sweeping his flashlight across the ground. Something pale caught the beam. He crouched down. In the mud, half buried beneath a boot mark, lay Henry's old work hat, crushed, damp, and streaked with dirt. The sheriff lifted it carefully. Around him, the field was silent, the volunteers still calling Henry's name in the distance. The air seemed to hold its breath. Holt stared at the hat for a long moment, feeling a cold certainty form in his chest. This was no ordinary disappearance. Henry Doss had not wandered off. Something had taken him from his land, and whatever happened here had begun at that gate where his hat now lay in the mud. Silent proof that something terrible had unfolded in the early light of that Tennessee morning. For most of his life, Henry Doss had belonged to the land more than to the town around it. His 40-acre farm sat just outside Cleveland, Tennessee, a stretch of rolling earth bordered by oak trees and quiet fences that had stood for generations. The place was old, weathered, and peaceful, much like the man himself. Henry had been a widower for over 15 years. His wife Clara had passed from illness, leaving him with the silence that comes when a house loses its second voice. After her death, Henry filled his days with work. He rose before sunrise and stayed out until the last light faded. The farm was not just a home. It was his history, his comfort, and his only companion. Neighbors described him as steady. He rarely missed a market day, driving his pickup to town every Saturday to sell fresh vegetables and jars of honey. People trusted him. If Henry Doss said he would do something, it was done before the week ended. He spoke softly, smiled rarely, and preferred listening over talking. His small successes on the farm never made him wealthy, but he never wanted more than what the land provided. The Doss property had been in his family since before the war, passed down through hands that worked the same soil. Henry saw it as his duty to protect it. When new developments began pushing outward from town, paved roads, new houses, and signs advertising lots for sale, Henry refused every offer that came to his door. The developers called him stubborn. His neighbors called him loyal. He called it staying true. He lived simply. Mornings began with the same old radio, afternoons with the sound of a tractor engine, and evenings on the porch with a single cup of coffee. His world was small but peaceful, shaped by routine and surrounded by memories of better times. People in Bradley County often said Henry had no enemies. Yet in the years before he vanished, the edges of his quiet life began to fray. Strangers started showing up, asking about his land value, offering prices that climbed higher each month. He always turned them away, polite but firm. A few of them left angry. Some locals remembered hearing Henry mention one man in particular, a contractor who had pressed him harder than the rest. The conversation had ended with raised voices and the slamming of a truck door. But Henry never reported trouble, and the matter faded into local rumor. When he went missing, that calm reputation made his disappearance feel impossible. The idea that a man so grounded could simply vanish unsettled everyone who knew him. It did not fit his nature. Henry did not leave things unfinished, and he did not leave home without a reason. For 3 days after he disappeared, deputies searched every acre of his property. The fields, the barns, the creek that curved through the back of his land, all were checked again and again. The house remained untouched, exactly as he had left it. Then, on the 4th day, a deputy found something along the creek line. A torn jacket tangled in the reeds and a ring of metal half buried in mud. It was a set of truck keys, Henry's keys, lying less than 20 yards from the water. The search team fell silent. The wind moved through the grass, carrying only the sound of the creek. Henry Doss had not walked away from his life. Whatever had happened to him had happened right there, on the land he had spent his whole life protecting. For 2 long days, Henry Doss's farm became the center of a full-scale search. Deputies, volunteers, and neighbors covered every acre of his land. They waded through tall grass, pushed through brush, and followed the bends of the narrow creek that wound behind the property. The missing farmer's name echoed across the fields, as if the land itself might answer back. By the 3rd morning, fatigue had begun to set in. The air was heavy and still, filled with the damp scent of earth and river water. Search dogs moved along the banks, their handlers quiet, listening for the faintest sound. Nothing had turned up except Henry's torn jacket and keys. But Sheriff Raymond Holt was certain there was more to find. Near midday, one of the volunteers called out. His boot had struck something hard beneath a patch of soft soil not far from the creek's curve. Deputies moved in quickly, clearing away the top layer of dirt with gloved hands. What they uncovered stopped everyone cold. It was a shovel. Its wooden handle splintered, the blade darkened by what looked like old, dried blood. The tool was half buried, as though someone had tried to conceal it but never finished the job. Sheriff Holt knelt beside it, studying the ground around the spot. The soil was disturbed, uneven, with flattened patches of grass that stretched toward the woods. A deputy pointed out a set of long drag marks that trailed away from the creek, faint but visible in the mud. They led toward a cluster of trees and disappeared where the ground hardened. No footprints were clear enough to trace, but the pattern suggested something, or someone, had been moved. The sheriff ordered the area sealed off. Forensic technicians were brought in from the county seat. They photographed everything: the shovel, the tracks, the impressions near the reeds. Samples from the shovel were carefully bagged and labeled. Early tests confirmed what they all feared. The stains were blood. Henry Doss's disappearance was no longer a missing person case. It was beginning to look like foul play. The search widened beyond the farm. Dogs were brought in again, their handlers guiding them through the woods and along the gravel road that ran behind the property. For nearly half a mile, the dogs followed a faint scent, noses low, tails stiff with focus. Then, just past the old gate where the farmland met the road, the trail stopped. Handlers tried again from different points, circling wider, but the result was the same. The scent vanished at the road's edge. as if Henry had been taken from that point onward. There were no tire impressions, no footprints, no discarded objects. Just silence. Detective Laura Gaines, recently assigned to assist with the case, stood beside the road as dusk settled in. She watched the last light fade over the tree line, her notepad filled with unanswered questions. The evidence did not fit any simple story. There was no sign of robbery, no indication of a struggle inside the house, and no reason for Henry to leave his land willingly. Reporters began to gather near the property line, their cameras flashing against the dark. The story of the missing farmer had spread beyond Bradley County. Locals whispered theories: robbery gone wrong, revenge, or a land dispute that had turned violent. Yet none of it explained the shovel, the drag marks, or the clean disappearance of a man who had lived his entire life within a few square miles. That night, as the investigation team packed up, a new report came into the sheriff's office. A local hunter named Tommy Blake had contacted dispatch after hearing the news on the radio. He told the operator that on the morning Henry Doss vanished, he had been out before dawn checking his traps near the same gravel road behind the farm. He had heard a vehicle speeding by in the early light, faster than anyone usually drove that route. The sound came suddenly, then faded into silence. The hunter had not thought much of it then. But now, with what had been found near the creek, that sound might have been the last trace of Henry Doss leaving his land, alive or not. Detective Laura Gaines arrived in Bradley County 3 days after the blood-stained shovel was found. She had recently transferred from Knoxville, known for her methodical approach and quiet persistence. The case of the missing farmer was already drawing attention, not because of its scale, but because of how little made sense. The sheriff handed her the file, a thin folder with more questions than answers. Inside were photographs of Henry Doss's property, the creek, the torn jacket, and the shovel that had changed everything. Gaines read through the reports in silence, her eyes narrowing as she reached the timeline of the morning Henry vanished. Every entry ended the same way. No further trace found. Her first stop was across the field, to the modest home of Earl and Linda Cates, the neighbors who had first raised the alarm. Earl stood on his porch, hat in hand, still shaken by the discovery that his friend and neighbor had vanished without a sound. He repeated the story he had already told the deputies: the morning silence, the untouched breakfast, the open door. Nothing new, but Gaines noticed how he hesitated when she mentioned the drag marks by the creek. His eyes drifted toward the tree line as if searching for something that was no longer there. Linda joined them at the door, speaking softly, careful with every word. She said Henry had been nervous lately, more withdrawn than usual. 2 weeks before his disappearance, a man in a white pickup had come by, asking about Henry's land. Linda remembered the conversation ending abruptly, Henry's voice raised for the first time in years. That name came up again later that day, Frank Milner, a contractor from the nearby town of Benton. According to locals, Milner had been buying up farmland for a new development project. Henry's land stood right in the middle of the planned expansion. He had refused every offer, no matter how high. Rumors spread quickly through the small community. Some said Henry had finally agreed to meet with Milner the week he went missing. Others swore they saw Milner's truck parked near the Doss property days before the disappearance. But no one had proof, and in towns like Bradley County, talk often traveled faster than truth. Gaines met with Sheriff Holt at the station that evening. The evidence board behind them was still almost empty. Photographs, a hand-drawn map of the farm, and a single line connecting Henry's name to Frank Milner's. It was not enough to call him a suspect, but it was enough to keep the investigation alive. The sheriff's office organized more volunteer searches, expanding the grid to neighboring fields and wooded areas. News crews arrived from Chattanooga, setting up cameras near the old barn. Within a week, local headlines began calling it the Vanishing Farmer Mystery. The attention brought tips, but none led anywhere. One caller claimed Henry had been seen at a bus stop in Georgia. Another said he had gone into hiding after a business deal gone bad. Each lead was checked, each one dismissed. By the second week, hope began to fade. Detective Gaines visited Frank Milner's office, but he was not there. His assistant said he was working out of state on a project. Gaines noted the vague answer and left her card behind. When she drove past Henry's farm that evening, the fields were dark except for the soft flashing of patrol lights. The search had ended for the night, but something in her gut told her the case was just beginning. 2 days later, a neighbor named Wes Collier walked into the sheriff's office. Nervous and pale, he told deputies that he had seen Frank Milner's white pickup parked along the gravel road near Henry's property on the very morning Henry vanished. He said it had been there just after dawn, engine idling, but he had been too far away to see who was inside. It was the first concrete sighting in the entire case. Deputies took his statement carefully, logging every detail. But when they returned to confirm it later that week, Wes changed his story. He said he must have been mistaken, that it could have been any truck, maybe even another neighbor's. Detective Gaines read the revised statement in silence. Retractions like that were rarely mistakes. Someone, she thought, had gotten to him. And whoever it was, they wanted the name Frank Milner to disappear just as completely as Henry Doss had. In Bradley County, silence had always been the language of the land. But after Henry Doss vanished, that silence turned uneasy. Every conversation in town seemed to circle back to the same question. How could a man like Henry disappear without leaving a trace? At church gatherings, his name slipped into every prayer. Pastor Miller mentioned him from the pulpit each Sunday, asking for guidance and for truth to surface. In the pews, people bowed their heads, some with genuine sorrow, others with curiosity they would never admit aloud. At the diner off the main road, whispers carried from booth to booth. Some said it was robbery. Maybe someone had followed Henry home from the market. Others believed he had run away, though no one could explain why a man so loyal to his land would ever do that. And then there were darker theories: revenge, property disputes, secrets hidden beneath the surface of a quiet life. Farmers began locking their barns at night. Wives waited up for their husbands who worked late in the fields. The sense of safety that once wrapped around the community had started to unravel. A single disappearance had made everyone look at their own routines differently, as if the same mystery could reach them next. Local stores placed missing posters near their entrances. The photo of Henry taken from a market day 2 summers earlier. It showed a faint smile, the kind a man wears only for the sake of the camera. Beneath the picture, the sheriff's office phone number printed in bold black ink began to fade under the summer sun. Henry's daughter, Martha Doss Riley, traveled down from Nashville the week after the shovel was found. She stood before the cameras with steady eyes and spoke plainly. Her father had lived an honest life, she said, and someone out there knew what had happened to him. She pleaded for answers, for truth, for anything that could end the endless waiting. Days passed, then weeks. Leads came and went. Each one fell apart under investigation. Martha began visiting the sheriff's office every few days, asking for updates, only to leave with the same tight-lipped reassurances that the department was still working every angle. Detective Laura Gaines watched her frustration grow. She understood it. There was only so long a family could live on patience when every day without an answer felt like another layer of dust settling over the truth. By early autumn, the fields around Henry's property had gone quiet again. The search teams no longer gathered at sunrise. The news crews had moved on. What began as a county-wide effort had become a slow routine of unanswered calls and unreturned letters. The sheriff continued to promise progress, but his voice carried less conviction each time. The town had moved from fear to fatigue. Even the prayers at church grew shorter, less certain. By late autumn, the Doss farm stood empty under gray skies. The barn door hung crooked in the wind, and weeds climbed along the porch steps. As the first frost touched the edges of Tennessee, the case that had once consumed Bradley County fell still. Winter was coming, and with it, the cold silence of a mystery that seemed ready to be forgotten. The months after Henry Doss's disappearance blurred together. What began as an active search turned into a quiet routine of false hope. The sheriff's office followed every tip that came through, no matter how unlikely. Each one seemed to promise progress, only to collapse under the weight of its own emptiness. In early 1995, a call came from Dalton, Georgia, just across the state line. A woman swore she had seen a man who looked like Henry sitting alone at a roadside cafe. The description matched, right down to the tan jacket and old farm hat. Deputies drove out the same afternoon. They questioned the man the woman had seen, but it was not Henry. It was a traveling worker from Kentucky, just passing through. The report joined dozens of others in the growing stack of disappointment. Later that spring, a drifter walked into a police station in Chattanooga and confessed to killing an old farmer near Cleveland. The story spread fast, reaching the Doss family before detectives could confirm a single detail. For a few hours, the county held its breath. But when Detective Laura Gaines sat across from the man in the interview room, she knew something was wrong. He spoke in circles, changing names and places with each sentence. His description of the farm did not match, and his story fell apart under questioning. He was seeking shelter, not justice. The confession was false. The next year brought a cruel twist. Hunters found human remains in the woods of neighboring McMinn County. The discovery reignited the Doss investigation overnight. Reporters returned, the sheriff called in the forensic team, and Martha Riley drove down from Nashville once more. But within days, dental records confirmed the body belonged to another missing man, a local mechanic who had vanished 2 years earlier. The relief and despair mixed painfully. The Doss family had hoped for closure, but closure never came. By 1997, the town's focus had shifted elsewhere. New crimes replaced old mysteries. Henry's name appeared less often in the papers. But Detective Gaines could not let go. Even after being reassigned to another district, she kept the case file within reach. Some nights she stayed late at her desk, rereading reports, studying photographs, replaying interviews. The blood-stained shovel, the drag marks, the missing truck keys, all pieces that should have formed a picture, but never did. Meanwhile, Frank Milner, the contractor once linked to Henry through rumor, quietly sold his business. He told acquaintances he needed to move closer to family in Alabama. To those who knew him, the timing felt convenient. There was never enough evidence to question him formally, but his departure deepened the unease surrounding the case. Detective Gaines requested surveillance or follow-up, but her request was denied. The department had limited resources, and with no new leads, the Doss case no longer held priority. She watched the investigation slip further from her hands, each file note turning into a reminder of what was left undone. Years passed. The Doss farm grew over with weeds. The fence collapsed under time and weather. Martha stopped calling the sheriff's office as often. The unanswered questions had become part of daily life. Then came 1998. A gray afternoon at the Bradley County Sheriff's Department marked the quiet end of what had once been their most mysterious case. An evidence clerk sealed the Doss file in a cardboard box, labeled it inactive, cold case, and placed it among dozens of others in a metal storage shelf. Detective Gaines stood by the window, watching the winter rain streak across the glass. She knew what the label meant, not that the case was solved, but that it was forgotten. Yet somewhere in her mind, the image of Henry's empty truck and that crushed hat in the mud refused to fade. The official records closed, but the story had not. Not yet. Time has a way of swallowing stories that do not find answers. After 1998, the disappearance of Henry Doss slipped quietly from the headlines and into memory. His farm, once alive with the sound of chickens and tractor engines, fell into silence. The land was eventually sold at auction to a developer. The barn collapsed after years of neglect, the wood darkened by weather and age. Martha Doss Riley, Henry's daughter, moved back to Nashville for good. Each spring she drove down to Bradley County to visit the field where her father had last been seen. She laid flowers near the old gatepost and stood for a while, saying nothing. Without a body there was no grave, only soil and unanswered questions. The sheriff who once led the search retired. The new administration had newer cases, bigger crimes, faster priorities. The vanishing farmer mystery, as the papers once called it, became a footnote in county archives. For many in Bradley County, it faded into a local legend, a story told to newcomers over coffee or around church suppers. The farmer who just vanished, they would say, shaking their heads as if it had all been a strange dream. Detective Laura Gaines stayed with the force for another 17 years. She worked homicides, thefts, missing persons, but none left a mark like Henry Doss. His case had been her first major investigation, and her first failure. When she retired in 2015, she boxed up her career in files and medals, but one thing stayed behind: a framed photo of Henry on her desk. It was the same photograph that had been used on the missing posters, his quiet eyes staring just past the camera. She placed it in her home study beside her certificates and kept it there, dusting the frame once in a while. Sometimes, when the evening news ran stories about new forensic breakthroughs, Laura wondered if the shovel from Henry's case still existed, sealed somewhere in evidence storage, forgotten under labels and tape. She had always believed that the truth was still there, waiting for the right tools to uncover it. In 2023, that belief finally found ground. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation announced a statewide initiative to re-examine unsolved cold cases using advanced DNA extraction techniques, methods that had not existed in the 1990s. Dozens of counties sent their old evidence to the state crime lab. Among them was a sealed box from Bradley County, marked 1994, DOS case. Inside that box lay the weathered remains of the evidence: Henry's torn jacket, a few soil samples, and the blood-stained shovel found near the creek almost 30 years earlier. The label on the bag was faded, but the evidence seal had remained intact all those years. Forensic analyst Ryan McMillan, a quiet man known for his precision, was assigned the file. To him, the name Henry Doss meant nothing more than a line on a form, another unsolved entry among many. But when he opened the evidence bag, the faint smell of rust and earth carried a strange weight. It was as if the past had been waiting for this moment. Modern DNA testing could do what 1990s technology never could. Even degraded material, blood long dried and soaked into wood, could now yield results. Using a micro-extraction process, Ryan carefully removed samples from the handle and blade of the shovel. The tests began. Machines hummed softly under the sterile lights, breaking down decades-old evidence into code. Across the hall, TBI cold case analysts pulled the original reports for reference. The photographs showed the same images Detective Gaines had studied years ago: the drag marks by the creek, the crushed hat in the mud, the truck with its keys missing. The evidence told a story that had never been finished. Weeks passed as the samples processed. The first results came back inconclusive. Ryan repeated the test, adjusting for contamination. On the third run, faint genetic markers began to appear, a partial DNA profile. The sequence was incomplete, but it was enough for a database search. Ryan entered the data into the combined DNA index system, the national network that cross-references millions of profiles from across the country. The screen flickered, and the progress bar moved slowly. He leaned back, rubbing his eyes. To him, this was routine. Most cold case samples led nowhere. Then the cursor stopped. A soft chime sounded. On the screen, a message appeared: "Partial match detected." Ryan froze. The database had found a partial correlation between the genetic material on Henry's shovel and a DNA profile in the system, one collected years later from an entirely different investigation. The match was not full, but it was significant enough to warrant review. He stared at the name attached to the record: Milner. F. Frank Milner. The same name that had once appeared in the 1994 suspect notes. For a moment, the lab felt completely still. The hum of machines faded into the background. Almost 30 years of silence, buried beneath paperwork and dust, had just been disturbed. Ryan printed the report, sealing it in a new folder marked Priority, DOS Case, DNA Reassessment. He walked it to the senior investigator's office, leaving faint fingerprints on the edge of the paper. The case that Bradley County had buried in storage was alive again. And this time, the evidence had started to speak. When the partial DNA match came through, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation moved quickly. The name Frank Milner resurfaced after nearly 3 decades of silence, a ghost from a forgotten file. In 1994, he had been nothing more than a local contractor with a temper and a rumor attached to his name. Now, in 2023, the science that once did not exist had reached across time to call him back into question. TBI officials contacted the Bradley County Sheriff's Office, requesting the original case materials. The old files arrived in a weathered cardboard box, the edges brittle with age. Inside were photographs, typed reports, and Laura Gaines's handwritten notes, each page a reminder of a story left unfinished. The team met in a quiet conference room, the air thick with the gravity of rediscovery. The new lead was fragile but promising, a partial DNA match between the blood on the shovel and Frank Milner. Now 74 years old and living in a small town outside Huntsville, Alabama detectives began with confirmation. They obtained a fresh DNA sample from Milner through a routine database update, one connected to a commercial licensing background check. The results came back within days. The match strengthened. The blood on the shovel was Frank Milner's. With that, the case reopened officially. Detective Sarah Hinton, who had inherited Laura Gaines's desk years earlier, was assigned to lead the renewed investigation. She studied the old photographs, the field gate, the creek line, the drag marks disappearing into the woods, and realized something had never been explored. The original reports had mentioned sections of the creek that were inaccessible due to heavy flooding in 1994. Those areas had never been searched thoroughly. Working with forensic geologists, Sarah ordered ground-penetrating radar, GPR, to survey the old Doss property. The land, now divided and partially developed, still held a section of untouched terrain along the creek bend. It was muddy, overgrown, and half swallowed by time, but it was there. On a grey morning in early October 2023, the team arrived with their equipment. The radar scans began. Slowly, bright patches appeared on the monitor, anomalies in the soil, shapes that did not match natural patterns. One area stood out near the lowest point of the creek bend, close to where the drag marks had once ended. The site was cordoned off. Investigators began to dig. The first few inches yielded nothing but clay and roots. Then one of the technicians noticed something unusual. The texture of the soil changed. It was looser, darker, disturbed long ago and left to settle. As the digging continued, the metallic edge of a rusted handle surfaced. It looked like the remnant of a farm tool, eaten by years of decay. Moments later, a fragment of burlap appeared, hardened and fused with the earth. The air went still. The excavation slowed. Gloved hands brushed away layers of soil with measured care until the shape beneath became unmistakable. Human remains. The discovery sent a ripple through the entire scene. Every movement became precise, every word hushed. Within the bundle, bones were found wrapped in the decayed fabric, aligned as though someone had buried them in haste. Near the chest area, a small metal tag glinted faintly under the light. The excavation stopped until evidence technicians arrived. The remains were photographed, documented, and carefully lifted from the earth. After nearly 30 years, Henry Doss had been found. At the state lab, forensic anthropologists worked to confirm the identity. The bones were aged, consistent with a man in his late 60s. Dental records, preserved from Henry's medical files, were retrieved and compared. The results came back the next morning. A match. It was official. Henry Doss, the missing farmer from Bradley County, had been found less than half a mile from his own home. Detective Hinton called Martha Riley personally. The conversation was brief. Martha did not cry. She only asked if they were sure. When Hinton confirmed it, there was silence on the line, followed by a soft exhale that carried both grief and relief. After 29 years, her father was no longer missing. He was home. As the evidence was catalogued, that metal tag found within the burlap caught immediate attention. It was worn but still legible. Stamped into the surface were the words, Milner Contracting Co. The same business Frank Milner had owned in 1994, the one he sold before leaving Tennessee. The tag had likely come from a tool or supply sack used during his work. Its presence inside the burial wrappings could not be explained as coincidence. It was direct physical proof linking Milner to the scene where Henry's body had been hidden, the evidence that had waited almost 3 decades in the soil now, pointed with precision toward a single name. When the forensic team presented their findings to TBI command, the room fell into heavy silence. The old story, once dismissed as a rural mystery, had turned into something darker, something deliberate. Detective Hinton stared at the tag lying on the evidence tray. The letters, Milner Contracting Co., caught the light as if they had been waiting to be read again. The discovery had done more than reveal a body. It had unearthed the truth that the county had buried along with it. And for the first time since 1994, the path forward was clear. The case of Henry Doss was no longer a question of what happened. It was now a question of who buried him and why. When the discovery of Henry Doss's remains reached the news, Laura Gaines was sitting in her small Tennessee home, sorting through old case papers she could never bring herself to throw away. The television played softly in the background, a headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Remains found in 1994, cold case, DNA links, contractor to site. She froze. The words hit her like a pulse from the past. After nearly 30 years, the case that had haunted her career had resurfaced. The one she could never close. The one she had never stopped thinking about. By nightfall, Laura was on the phone with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, offering her assistance. She had retired 8 years earlier, but her name still carried weight among those who remembered her discipline and stubbornness. The TBI agreed. Within days, she was back, not as a detective, but as a consultant, walking once more through the corridors of a case that had defined her life. Her first stop was the evidence room. The same file she had boxed in 1998 sat open on the table, now surrounded by new reports, photos, and the fresh soil analysis from the creek site. She ran her fingers over her old handwriting in the margins, notes written in urgency, frustration, and disbelief. One page caught her attention, an interview transcript with Frank Milner dated June 12, 1994. In it, Milner claimed he had been on a work call at a construction site in Chattanooga the morning Henry disappeared. He had repeated that detail several times during questioning, and back then, it seemed unremarkable. But Laura now saw the flaw. In her notes, she had scribbled a small observation, no confirmation on timing. The phone logs from 1994 had never verified the call. Technology had been limited then, and she had been forced to move on without proof. But now digital archives existed, reconstructed from business records that had been digitized over the years. Laura requested access through the TBI data unit. Within 2 days, they found what she had always suspected. The phone record showed the call had been made at 11:42 a.m., not early morning, as Milner had claimed. By that time, Henry was already missing. The false alibi shifted the entire timeline. Frank Milner had placed himself away from Bradley County at the exact moment Henry vanished, but the phone record proved he had not left until hours later. Detective Sarah Hinton called it a breakthrough. Laura called it a correction, long overdue. Together, they began rebuilding the puzzle. They interviewed Milner's former employees, men who had worked for his contracting company in the early 1990s. Many were retired now, scattered across the South. Some barely remembered the details, but a few pieces aligned. One worker recalled a heated argument between Milner and Henry at the farmer's market months before the disappearance. Another mentioned a land deal Milner had been desperate to close, a development project that required part of Henry's acreage near the creek. Henry refused to sell. Milner had complained openly about it, saying the farmer was standing in the way of progress. As the statements accumulated, the motive grew clearer. This was never random. It was personal. The TBI assembled a full report combining the DNA evidence, phone record discrepancy, and testimony from Milner's former crew. Every thread pointed in the same direction, toward a man who had spent 30 years living quietly with a secret buried in Tennessee soil. Laura sat in the corner of the operations room, watching the new generation of investigators prepare what she had once dreamed of doing, confronting the man who had taken Henry's life. Her hands trembled slightly as she reviewed the briefing packet. It had taken nearly 3 decades, but the path was open again. As the sun dipped behind the hills that evening, a team of TBI agents loaded into unmarked vehicles outside headquarters. The warrant sat in Detective Hinton's briefcase, freshly signed by a judge. Their destination, Huntsville, Alabama. After years of silence, they were going to knock on Frank Milner's door. The Alabama sun was just beginning to rise when unmarked vehicles turned into a quiet subdivision outside Montgomery. The street was lined with trimmed lawns and aging oaks, the kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. But that morning, the calm shattered. Detectives Sarah Hinton and Laura Gaines stepped out of the lead vehicle, warrant in hand. Ahead of them stood a modest brick house with white shutters and a faded mailbox that read, F. Milner. Frank Milner, once a sharp and ambitious contractor, was now 74 years old. He lived alone, tending to his garden, keeping to himself. The neighbors described him as polite, quiet, almost invisible. None of them knew that the man next door had been hiding the truth about a killing that haunted Bradley County for nearly 3 decades. When the agents knocked, it took nearly a full minute for the door to open. Milner appeared in a flannel shirt and work jeans, his face pale with confusion. Detective Hinton introduced herself and handed him the warrant. He barely read it before his eyes flicked up, meeting Laura's. For a second, he looked as though he had seen a ghost. Laura spoke softly. Frank Milner, you are under arrest for the murder of Henry Doss. He did not resist. He simply nodded, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. At the Montgomery field office, the interview room was silent except for the faint hum of the recorder. Frank sat across from the detectives, his hands folded, his breathing uneven. The years had worn him down, but the tension in his eyes had not faded. Detective Hinton began with the evidence. She laid out the photographs, the shovel, the burlap, the metal tag stamped Milner Contracting Co. Then she slid the DNA report across the table. Frank stared at the papers without speaking. When she mentioned the false alibi, his hands tightened slightly. Laura watched him closely. She recognized the small signs, the downward glance, the dry swallow, the silence that always came before a confession. It was an accident, he said finally, the words thin and trembling. I did not mean for it to go that way. He spoke slowly, each sentence dragging up memories he had buried long ago. On the morning of June 10, 1994, he had driven to Henry's farm before sunrise. He wanted to confront him about the property line near the creek. Milner had been preparing a development project and needed part of that land for access to a new construction site. Henry refused, just as he always had. The argument turned heated. Words were exchanged, voices rose, and in a moment of rage, Milner grabbed a shovel resting near the fence line. He swung once. Henry fell instantly. Frank said nothing for several minutes after that. He stared at the table, breathing shallowly, as though the memory itself was suffocating him. When Detective Hinton asked what he did next, he spoke again, almost whispering. I panicked, he said. I thought I could fix it. I wrapped him in what I had in the truck, burlap and tools from the job site. I dug by the creek near the bend. The ground was soft from the rain. I buried him there before anyone woke up. He wiped his face with a trembling hand. I left before the sun came up. Drove straight to Chattanooga and made that phone call to make it look like I had been working. Laura's eyes stayed fixed on him, but her expression did not change. She had imagined this moment for years, yet hearing the truth brought no satisfaction. Only quiet finality. When Frank finished, he leaned back in his chair. I have lived with it every day, he said. Every time I saw that land on the news, every time I closed my eyes, I told myself it was an accident. But I knew it was more than that. The interview ended shortly after. Frank Milner signed his confession in unsteady handwriting. The officers read him his rights and led him away in handcuffs. Outside, the Alabama sky had turned gold, the light falling across the patrol cars like a quiet reckoning. Back in Tennessee, word spread quickly. After 29 years, the mystery of the vanishing farmer was no longer a question whispered over coffee. It was headline news. Old neighbors gathered in disbelief. Martha Riley received the call from Detective Hinton and wept silently, not for justice alone, but for the decades her father's name had been spoken with uncertainty. In Bradley County, the fields that once held silence now carried the echo of closure and guilt. The truth was finally unearthed, but peace would not come easily. As dusk fell over the Tennessee hills, the town braced itself for what was coming next, the trial, the judgment, and the reckoning that no one had expected after 30 long years. The news of Frank Milner's arrest spread through Bradley County faster than it had in 1994, when Henry Doss first vanished. For nearly 3 decades, Milner had been seen as a man of integrity, a respected businessman, a church donor, a name listed on local sponsorship plaques. He had funded park renovations, contributed to the volunteer fire department, and even spoken at charity events about community progress. To many, he had been the model of small-town success. So when the story broke that Frank Milner had confessed to killing Henry Doss, the quiet farmer who refused to sell him land, the town could not believe it. Conversations in diners and hardware stores fell silent the moment his name was mentioned. People who once praised him now struggled to speak. It cannot be true, some said. He was a good man. Others whispered that they had always suspected something beneath his calm demeanor, but none had ever imagined this. Reporters arrived from across the state. The story of a 30-year-old cold case solved by modern DNA technology captured national attention. Television crews lined the courthouse steps, cameras flashing as deputies escorted Milner inside, his face hidden behind weathered hands. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavy, like a place holding its breath. Wooden benches filled with townspeople, former colleagues, and members of the Doss family. Martha Riley, Henry's daughter, sat in the front row, her hands clasped in her lap. She had waited 29 years for this moment. Her father's name, once a mystery, was finally spoken in pursuit of truth, not speculation. Detective Laura Gaines sat quietly behind the prosecution team. Though she had returned only as a consultant, her presence carried weight. She had opened the case when it was fresh, watched it grow cold, and lived long enough to see it come full circle. During the trial, prosecutors presented the story with precision. They showed the jury the blood-stained shovel, the metal tag from Milner Contracting Co., and the forensic timeline that placed Frank at Henry's property that morning. They played recordings of his confession, calm, weary, and impossible to misinterpret. The defense argued for leniency, claiming the death had been accidental, the act of a man who panicked after a confrontation gone wrong. But the evidence was too strong, the silence too long, and the burial too deliberate. When Frank Milner took the stand, his voice was thin. He admitted what he had done, how anger had blinded him, how guilt had followed him through every year that passed. He spoke of nightmares, of driving past farms and seeing Henry's face in the fields. He said he never intended to kill him, but he had known it was wrong the moment he hid the body. After 5 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for just 4 hours. When they returned, the courtroom was silent. The foreman stood. We find the defendant, Frank Milner, guilty of second-degree murder. A wave of quiet swept through the room. Not relief, not applause, just stillness. Martha Riley lowered her head, tears slipping down her face. Laura Gaines closed her eyes. Frank Milner did not look at anyone. He simply nodded, accepting the words that had waited almost 30 years to be spoken aloud. In the weeks that followed, Bradley County began to heal in small, uncertain steps. The Doss family held a funeral at the church where Henry had once worshipped. His remains returned from forensic custody were placed in a simple oak casket and buried beside his late wife, Clara Doss, in the small cemetery on the hill. The ceremony was quiet. No speeches, no cameras, just family, neighbors, and a few aging officers who had never forgotten his case. As the final shovel of earth fell, the wind moved gently through the trees. For the first time, Henry Doss rested where he belonged. The town that had once been divided by rumor came together for a moment of shared reckoning. They spoke not only of Henry and Frank, but of how easily truth can disappear beneath time, and how hard it is to bring it back to light. When the crowd dispersed, Laura Gaines remained by the graveside. She looked at the carved names, Henry and Clara Doss, and felt the quiet weight of both closure and sorrow. The truth had been found, but it had come at a cost she knew too well. As the sun dipped low behind the ridge, Laura touched the brim of her hat and stood still. Around her, the cemetery was silent, peaceful, but heavy with memory. And in that stillness, she felt the presence of every face she had ever investigated, every unanswered file left behind. The Doss case was over, but the ache of the unsolved ones still lingered. A reminder that justice, even when it comes, never truly lets go. The fields that once belonged to Henry Doss lie quiet again. The fences are broken, the soil untended, and the barn leans against the wind. Grass has reclaimed what farming once ordered. Only the distant hum of the highway breaks the stillness. Near the creek, the ground looks unchanged, just another patch of Tennessee earth. The same current that ran there in 1994 still moves today, carving slow paths around fallen branches and stone. Nothing in its surface tells of what was found beneath it. Yet the land remembers. When investigators unearthed the truth, they disturbed more than soil. They brought back a story that had been buried for nearly 30 years, a story of silence, of patience, and of the way truth endures even when everyone stops looking for it. Henry Doss never left his land. Through seasons of drought and flood, through the passing of families and ownership, he remained where he had always been, on the same ground he refused to sell. His absence once haunted Bradley County. His discovery changed it forever. After the trial ended and the news crews departed, the town returned to its rhythm. The case that once defined it became a memory, then a lesson. People spoke less about what happened and more about how long it had taken to uncover. Some said it proved that justice never expires. Others believed it showed how easily it can fade if no one continues the search. Detective Laura Gaines retired once more after the verdict. She refused interviews, declined offers to write a book, and kept no public record of her involvement. In her home office, the Doss file rested on a shelf, its pages yellowed, the edges marked by time. On the front, she taped a single note written in her own hand: "Truth waits." For Henry's daughter, Martha Riley, life moved forward with quiet acceptance. She sold what remained of the farm but visited the cemetery often. There were no speeches, no grand statements, only the steady act of remembering. She once told a local reporter, "The land kept him. That is what he wanted." In the archives of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the Doss case sits marked as closed. Homicide solved, 2023. The report contains every detail: the discovery, the DNA match, the confession, and the conviction. Each paragraph ends neatly, as official language demands. But between the lines lies what cannot be written: the years of uncertainty, the toll of unanswered questions, the way time reshaped every person involved. Today, travelers pass the old property without noticing. The signpost is rusted, the gravel road half covered with weeds. Few remember the name attached to it, yet the story lingers like a faint echo, not in headlines, but in the soil itself. The Doss case is more than the account of a crime. It is a reminder of how long truth can stay hidden, waiting beneath ordinary ground. For decades, the earth carried its silence faithfully, until one day, technology and persistence uncovered what human eyes could not. The creek still moves with the same slow rhythm. The wind crosses the open field as it always has. Nothing in the landscape appears changed, but the ground holds a memory, a quiet, unspoken record of a man's final stand for what was his. In the end, justice did not come quickly or cleanly. It came through patience, through science, through the unwillingness of a few to let time erase a name. Henry Doss was not a headline or a mystery anymore. He was a farmer, a husband, a man who simply refused to leave his land. And in that refusal, his story remained written beneath it. The final words of the official report read, "Case concluded, but the land, the creek, and the wind carry a different message, that some truths are not concluded, only uncovered. The farmland stands empty now, silent as it was the morning he disappeared. The air feels unchanged, the soil heavy with history. And though Henry Doss has been laid to rest beside his wife, the story of his disappearance remains etched into the place itself. The land remembers, always.